It's like on Smallville, we used to say, we'll hide the peas in the mashed potatoes. It all starts with story. And everybody forgot that. There was a collective amnesia for 8 years when they thought we're going to force, whether it's a racial reckoning or a woke narrative, we're going to force it down people's throats because this is what's good for them and they need. It almost destroyed Hollywood.
My guest today is Philip Levens. He's a screenwriter and showrunner who has spent his career in places where myth, the uncanny, and primetime television meet. He was a writer and producer in the early seasons of Smallville, the series that reintroduced Superman to a generation looking for what the shape of heroism really looked like. He also wrote and produced on All Souls, Wolf Lake, Night Visions, and NBC's Knight Rider. He was an executive producer on Paramount's South Beach alongside Jennifer Lopez and created and ran the sci-fi limited series Ascension. Philip, welcome to Goodmakers podcast.
Thank you.
Philip, I think we first connected over X when I was sharing a little bit about my daughter, who was a teenager, and some of her teenage friends discovering Smallville, a show that was on my senior year of high school and then into my early years of college. And one of the things that really stood out to her was really how wholesome it was. And simultaneously, being my daughter, she picked up in the pilot episode all these little Easter eggs, like our first introduction to Clark Kent. He's carrying a textbook on Nietzsche, which I don't know, when I was in high school, Nietzsche, I don't think I had a Nietzsche textbook. First episode, pilot episode, has him in a kind of crucifix position as a scarecrow in the field. And she started picking up on this stuff. She's like, Dad, even in kind of teenage geared dramas back in your day, they were weaving in this kind of philosophy and mythological symbolism. And come to find out, Philip here is responsible for some of this. So Philip, could you tell me a little bit, how did you get involved in that show in particular? And take me through the process in which you're in a writer's room. Are you intentionally weaving in these sorts of nuggets? They have to be intentional, I imagine, but I'd be curious how that process came to be.
Well, I got hired on the show. My agent, said, do you want to work on the show? And I obviously had loved Superman since I was a kid. And I said, sure. And that's how I got hired on it. But absolutely, all of that stuff, we would always call it, hiding the peas in the mashed potatoes. You write stories on different levels. You write it for teenagers, you write it for adults, you write it for people who know the comics. The reference to Nietzsche obviously is the Übermensch, right? Which in English is Superman. So that's like he's literally Superman. But there's lots of Nietzsche quotes in those early seasons of Smallville. Obviously, the crucifix. There's a symbolic sort of linking of this child being sacrificed, coming from another world. There's all kinds of analogies there as well. And we really did try to make it wholesome. We looked at it as like, doing the small town all-American story, this kid from another world. And, one thing we always said is like, look, if Clark had landed somewhere else, and in fact, they've even made Superman graphic novels about this. For instance, Red Sun. If he landed in another place, he might have become a monster. But he was raised by these two great, because he has godlike powers, really. But he was raised by Ma and Pa Kent, and they're just salt of the earth, all-American people who raised him to be this great all-American boy. So it really does show, it really takes the nurture. I mean, the nurture over nature angle a little bit there as far as Clark goes.
Yeah, I was always fascinated by that in the graphic novels and comics too. You have that Red Sun arc. There's certainly one where he's raised in kind of, I don't want this word to get flagged on YouTube, but we'll just say post Weimar Republic Germany. And he turns out totally different. And instead, in our arc, he's raised by some Midwestern Methodist parents. They take him to church, they instill in him these kind of heartland American values. And And that always stood out to me as something that I think just people neglected. It was just like, well, he's just innately virtuous. And I was like, oh no, his character was shaped
It was
by his
definitely.
parents. In your own
And
life.
Smallville, and Smallville. I mean, he
Mm,
grew up in this
yeah,
small town, this farm town, and so those two things together really shaped him. I mean, even early though, even in the first season, we did an episode. I think it was Doris Egan who wrote it, where he has sort of a precognitive vision of the future, and he gets a
yeah,
glimpse of like endless tombstones,
yeah.
but he's still there, and so he's starting to get a sense that like he'll outlive everyone he knows because in the Superman mythology, as he gets older, he really stops aging because he's you know absorbs so much yellow sunlight that he basically, and there's a whole run in the comics and stuff in the mythology where he's around 50 or so. He basically lives like a thousand years at that age, and he becomes
Mm,
incredibly strong, which I've always liked that arc because he's like kind of middle-aged Superman, gray hair, but he's the strongest he ever is. But he'll outlive everyone he knows. So he's also going, even though he's made all these connections, he's going to lose them all. So it was always kind of a haunted arc. It's kind of a tragic character in a way, Superman, even more so than Batman, because Batman will live and die, but Superman has to, you know, see those he loves die.
Was this something, I mean, we think about, you know, Clark Kent's formative inputs of his parents and his local community. What in you, in your life, shaped you to be the kind of person that's like, I want to write stories about this stuff.
Well,
I'm gonna
I
sneak
grew up
in
in a
Nietzsche
town,
and mythology and,
I grew up in a small town. That actually made it easy to write Smallville because I mean, even though I grew up in the late 80s, I it might as well have been the 50s. It was a
mm,
small town, Lubbock, Texas. It wasn't small, but it really was. It was, very, very conservative, very 1950s, very kind of old fashioned, and so that made it easy to write. I knew the characters well, but I was always kind of interested in fusing genre and philosophy. I remember thinking that in college, like if someone could ever take Dostoevsky and Batman, that would be a really interesting fusion. I mean, that's kind of what Christopher Nolan did in his arc. He brought the two together because there was a time when comics in particular were very you know kind of broad and over the top. The Batman movies, with Michael Keaton were kind of cartoony, and obviously the stuff from the 60s was very cartoony and
yeah,
very broad, and it never had the kind of gravitas that really made it work again. And that was one of the big changes. And what happened, I mean, when I first got out to Hollywood, I mean, obviously I had read a lot of comic books as a kid, and it wasn't in the 90s, late 90s, I got out to Hollywood, and comic books were not uh, known or respected or understood at
mm,
all. Like the executives who were there, you have to realize executives usually are in their jobs for decades. And so when I first got out there, none of the executives knew anything about comic books at all. I remember when I wanted to do Iron Man really badly because he was always my favorite character. And I had my agent set up a meeting because New Line had the rights at the time.
hmm,
And this female executive was representing it. And I literally brought in Iron Man #1, and I talked about Iron Man, and she's like, well, I don't understand Iron Man. Why isn't he just a robot? Or things like, and she was the executive in charge of it. She'd made her bones she'd done some teen horse dramas. And I was like, this will, and then it finally, went into Kevin when Kevin got it. And obviously he knew the material, and I had a meeting with him about it too. Actually, some friends of mine got hired to write it, but they didn't get credit on it. I was one of the writers on Wonder Woman, the new
mm,
Wonder Woman, but I didn't get credit on it because, when you're working on underlying source material, anything which we were, I was looking at one of the runs of it, that stuff always reverts back to the network. I mean, the studio.
Hmm.
So IP, even if you do an original take on it, if they say, well, it's based on underlying source material, it's very difficult to get credit on that. But I remember when I first started doing Wonder Woman, even and this was, and I remember there were a bunch of executives, a lot of them were older, and one of them said, "Does she have to wear that silly bathing suit, with the American flag on it? And why don't we put her all in black?" I
Uh,
said, "Well, that'd be Catwoman." And I said, "She really, she is her costume. It's iconic. You can't
uh,
lose
uh,
that." So you had a lot of things like that you were fighting in the early days, but eventually it just became a tsunami. Those executives aged out, newer executives who had grown up with these characters came in, and then it kind of went too far in
uh,
reaction. Now it's like only comic book movies and only Marvel and DC IP for a long time it was impossible to sell that stuff. I remember I did a Marvel comic book as a TV show for this was for UPN, which later merged with the C with WB and became the CW. And I remember Ben Silverman called me and said, who later became the president of NBC. He's like, "I want you to do this character. It's called Night Thrasher." And I read it and I called him. I said, "Ben," I said, "this is the worst comic book I've ever read."
why this one?
I don't. It was he and Avi Arad. He got it from Avi Arad when he was in charge of Marvel,
Hmm.
and it was just something he had, and it was a Marvel title, and it was basically a black guy who went around like Harlem on a skateboard wearing football pads and a football helmet, beating up pimps and drug dealers. And I was like, it's cliched and it's kind of semi-racist, and it was like terrible. He's like, "I know it's terrible. Just do whatever you want with it." And so we kind of reinvented it into a Buffy-esque, uh,
Um,
mythology tied to ancient Egypt and whatnot. But anyway, the history of comic books and movies is really interesting. No one's really ever done a really long documentary on how the two kind of came about. Like there was not this master plan. It wasn't like Hollywood said we're going to do. It happened more because the creatives kept pushing it and they understood it. But it took a long time for it to get where it is today. And then obviously Hollywood always overreacts. They either go nothing or too far. So
okay, so you got to help me understand with no insider experience in this world whatsoever. You got to help me understand what is then like what is the evaluation matrix then that these executives at that time or maybe even today are going to. Obviously people can just be, well, it's the bottom line of how much money you would make. But it just seems wild to me that they wouldn't have familiarity with characters like
none.
Iron
They knew
Man that have
they made
sold really, really well. So what's the decision matrix here?
people think it's sold really well, but it hasn't. Before they made that Iron
That's
Man
true.
movie, it was almost unknown.
Yeah.
I knew him because I had grown up with him and always loved the idea because he was my favorite superhero because he was one that anybody could be. Like
Mm,
Batman. But Batman, you could say, well, he's just a human, but he happens to be the world's greatest detective and he's a genius and he's a billionaire and he's a great fighter. And, so you go, yes, he is within the realms of human possibility, but the very extreme. Whereas Tony Stark's obviously a computer genius and an inventor, but other than that, he's a pretty flawed person. In the
right.
comic books, he was an alcoholic. He had lots of problems, but I always liked the idea of someone just building a suit of armor and
Mm,
making you a superhero. So, but I remember when I went in and pitched it, they were like, no one had ever heard of it. They'd never read it. No, nobody knew it. Everybody knew Batman and Superman.
right.
And when I took Smallville, I mean, I remember telling my agent, he's like, "Do you think it'll work?" I said, "Superman always works. It's never had an iteration that hasn't been a success. All the movies have been hits. They've had TV shows, they've had radio shows, comic books, Superman records back in the 70s. Everything has always worked. It was just one of those concepts that, those two guys, Siegel and Schuster, just hit it out of the park. And obviously they called it Superman in kind of reaction to what was going on with the
Mhm.
misuse of Nietzsche in Germany at the time. So that was what they came back. And in fact, I don't know if you know this, but speaking of this, there was, I think it was not Goebbels, but maybe Rosenberg, one of the minister of propaganda, gave a speech before, the German parliament or something, or wherever it was. And he made how Superman could not be an Aryan, and all this stuff. So Superman's always had, this was,
Mhm.
pre-World War II,
Yeah.
but Superman's always been this zeitgeisty cultural figure, and it's, they chose as generic of a name as imaginable Clark Kent. It's like it's like
It's a good everyman name, right? I mean, that's
it is.
to resonate with the everyman. Okay, so obviously, as I'm piecing this together, trying to understand the things that have influenced you, Philip, and obviously there's comic books here that you've mentioned, but I mean, there's plenty of people that have spent a lifetime collecting and reading comics that don't get into Nietzsche and Dostoevsky. So where do those influences come in your life?
Well, those came in as I matured, obviously, and the comic book reading probably stopped when I was about 10. But at that point, I still had thousands of comics. I mean, they were really my first love of reading. And there's an old saying: a writer must first a reader be. So, what happens is for a writer, you're interested in a narrative. I remember for me in particular, I was in high school and I had loved all the Ian Fleming James Bond books,
Mm.
and I had read them all. And I was like, and I one day, and I had actually, I played football, but I was sick and I had to stay home for like a couple weeks, and I was really bored during football season, and I just uh, took out some paper and I wrote a James Bond story.
Hmm.
And I did it in the same voice as Ian Fleming because I just like the story so much. And I remember later I just left it around and typed it up and it was laying there. And some of my friends came over and they're like, "Who wrote this?" They were reading, "This is really good." I'm like, "I wrote it." And nobody believed me because I was kind of a jock. But I just had always, I guess, wanted to continue those narratives. And my imagination, I was very curious and very had a very vivid imagination, and that's how the writing came about. You
Hmm.
know.
I get a lot of questions from people because, I mean, as you know, at least from following me on X, one of the things I'm most interested in is how these sorts of guiding stories. I mean, one of my underlying theses is that in many ways, the theater, Netflix has functioned in some ways as alternative religious texts for people. They become guiding stories that provide moral instruction, a vision of what the good life should look like, what should we pursue with our days. And one of the questions I often get from readers of my work or listeners to this podcast is like, Paul, okay, so when these showrunners are writing this stuff or someone's submitting a script or they're working on a film, are they like consciously weaving these philosophical ideals, these mythological archetypes, this religious iconography? Is that happening? And I can say, well, oftentimes it seems pretty clear to me. I mean, and you can hear commentary from a director. I mean, I think of like a Zack Snyder and the way he's been very explicit in the past about his vision of Superman was very much playing into a Christ figure, and he did that in some very explicit ways. But when you're sitting in a room like this, I mean, I hear you saying, "Well, I've been influenced by these things, and so yeah, I'm gonna incorporate them into the story." How much of it is intentional? How much of it is just really good storytellers, maybe just kind of having their antenna up, and they're just kind of picking up on things in the zeitgeist? Could you talk about that process?
Yeah, it's a combination. Obviously, when we say writer, people forget what you really are as an artist. And an artist spends their life reading Jung and the Bible and Melville and mythology and understanding the Western tradition. And these are things that artists are interested in. They always have been. And so that's your educational background you have to have before you can really even try and conquer or not, or even engage with Western culture. If you don't understand what came before you, you can't do anything. So
Hmm.
you have to have that really broad background. I once had a teacher who said, a doctor just has to know medicine. An engineer just has to know machinery and engineering. A writer has to know medicine, engineering, history, philosophy, government, politics, religion,
Hmm.
psychology, sociology. You have to know a little of everything. So that's your education is a big part of it. And then you carry that with you. And then when you're breaking a story, you talk about characters, you talk about triangles, you talk about A storylines, B storylines, C storylines, reversals, but you also talk about thematics. You just put it on the board, theme, and so it's just you know, is conscious as plot turns.
Hmm.
So you say, well, here in this act we need a reversal, but
Hmm.
then you come back and go, how does that tie into the theme? And what you do is you keep working the story backward and forward, and you say, oh, theme can come in here, and then you find lots of what like happy accidents. You're like, oh, that's
Hmm.
perfect. And so in retrospect, it looks like, well, how did they plan that so geniusly? But a lot of times you're like, oh, here's where it goes. And
Hmm.
because you're working in that kind of collective unconsciousness, but you're thinking about all these different things and keeping them in your head, and they just come out. That's part of the
Hmm.
creative process. You know, one of my favorite lines about creating an art is art begins where craft ends. And so in TV and film, there's a ton of craft. People, someone once said, no one ever goes to see an opera and goes, oh, that was okay, but I think I could do better. I'm going to write an opera tonight. But people think I could have written a better movie than that. But they don't understand how much craft is involved in it.
Hmm.
The structures, the act breaks, the through lines, the runners. There's a lot of craft involved. And really only after you've completely mastered that craft, just like you've completely mastered Western culture, that's when the art begins. So when craft ends and you don't even see the fingerprints of craft anymore, then you can create something interesting.
You talk about themes. And so obviously you have the art of writing. I often think about this. There's a framework from a theologian, Dwight Hopkins, who talked about the three spheres of culture being spirit, aesthetic, and labor. And the notion of spirit being kind of the invisible values that then the aesthetics, which could be story, art, is trying to like somehow make manifest like an invisible value in a somehow visible form. When you guys are trying to, when you're trying to negotiate between, well, I know the craft of writing, but I also have these themes or like values that I want to see clearly made manifest in a story. How do you negotiate that tension? I'm sure you've maybe even been around writers where really, really good on the craft side, but maybe it feels like they don't have much to say, or vice versa. Like there's big ideas, but the craft struggles. How does that process work in you?
I've never seen anyone who's really good at the craft who can't do the other thing.
Mm.
It's much a lot of people have big ideas, but they don't know how to execute it. And the hard part of all art is from idea to execution. And that's where like you'll never see someone who's a master craftsman who just is an empty blank sort of slate. Like they know
Mm.
how the plot twists. There's definitely people who are hacks and they can but they generally don't even know craft well. I've worked with a lot of them. They're not good at either one. um Rarely do you see someone who goes, man, this guy really doesn't have much to say, but he sure can break a story. That just never happens because so
Mm.
much of storytelling is ideas, the breaks and the
Mm.
turns. You have to constantly come up with original ideas. And to do that, you have to be very clever and very smart. I worked with Jeff Loeb, who's a big comic book writer,
Mm.
who wrote A Man for All Seasons. You were talking about another Superman writer, and Jeff, even though he'd never written TV before that, was just a great idea, man. I mean, he was still learning that first season but man, he could just machine gun ideas. You know, he's written Daredevil, Iron Man.
Yeah.
I think he's literally written every single comic out there. He's a great guy, but he also told me he has two comics of every comic I think printed since 1960. He has every single one I've ever made.
What? Wow.
Yeah, warehouse is full of them.
Wow.
But you know, a great guy. And when you have enough awareness of the ideas, you obviously know the themes behind them all. You know what they signify. You know when there's Christ imagery or there's demonic imagery or whatever you want to do. When you're telling the story of a hero, it's very different than an anti-hero.
Mm,
So you know, American storytelling traditionally, is heroic. That's
mm,
what we want to do. We That's what we excel at. Where we've brought in a lot of nihilistic, kind of Euro storytelling, and particularly, I would say in the last decade or two. But that's not really an American indigenous storytelling. Remember, existentialism and that kind of nihilism grew up in Europe, particularly after World War One. And we've always been much better at being optimistic and can do and having triumphs. And a lot of critics mock that, and they have for decades. And that's one of the reasons I think we've lost that kind of storytelling, that kind of heroic, triumphant storytelling, because people thought it was corny or whatever. But you look back on, my kids will look back on 80s and 90s movies and go, these are great.
yes.
They go, what? Why can't we tell movies like that today? I was talking to my 17-year-old son yesterday. He goes, people my age, we look at the movies from the 80s and the 90s, the teen movies, because they're more about the teen reality than the movies made today about they're supposed to be about teen reality. He's like, those they had it better back then. And there's a lot of navel gazing and solipsistic storytelling going on these days, and I really dislike it. I find it boring and vapid and juvenile. And you need to get back to those classic American stories. I mean, look, there's nothing more classic and archetypal than an American Western.
Yeah.
Um, I think the John Wayne movies are just I mean, a movie like Hondo is just a masterpiece to me.
Mhm,
Obviously, The Searchers is,
mm,
but that kind of storytelling is also something that's deeply infused in my storytelling. An awareness of our history of movie making is very important, and a lot of people don't have that. They don't watch westerns anymore. They don't understand what makes American stories work globally is that hero.
mm,
Anybody can, be nihilistic and negative, but people, I used to always say, like, look, people, have a hard day. They work hard, they come home, they don't want to see something that's depressing and negative and miserable and everybody's spiteful and horrible. And that's too much of what we make, especially the stuff that's considered art or, you know, indie or whatever, or more, they want to turn on the TV. They want to feel there's a moral lesson here. There's good defeats evil. Evil's
mm.
punished. The universe is righted, and they can go to bed and they go on their way. They don't want to just at the end of the day everybody's equally horrible and what did anything matter? And I can't stand those kind of stories.
O Okay, well, we gotta pick at how those came to be, Philip, because, I've just put out a book here called Based on a True Story, and one of the primary, purposes of the book is to help people see how in culture, the zeitgeist, if you will, the stories that are in the zeitgeist influence our own individual stories, what Dan McAdams, psychologist, calls our narrative identity. And so I've been trying to
Mhm.
help people see that, we can move into the pop culture of the 90s. You get to 1999, you got your Fight Club, your Matrix. And I mean, as movies, as experiences, those were great. But that cynical deconstruction, the anti hero, the every person. I just saw this interview with Christopher Nolan, a young Chinese PhD student, had this brilliant series of questions for him. And she brought up this great point. As a Chinese student, probably seemingly trying to struggle with the stories we're telling here in America, And she says it's a fact of Hollywood that greatness is presented as privilege and that we must apologize for greatness. And I see this thing that's happened over the last couple of decades, and I've called it the anti-story. I'm curious, how in the world does that stuff practically get greenlit? So what is the difference between you coming to the check writers? So you're a writer, but you got to get your stuff to the check writers. They're going to produce it.
Mhm.
Why? What are the motivations, or what's happening where you might go and be like, I have this classic hero story and it's not flat, right? The notion that a hero triumphing over adversity is just like flat or boring is ridiculous, because we all endure adversity. You bring that kind of story to the check writer and they go, no, I don't think that's going to work. Instead, we're going to go with something cynical, jaded, postmodern. Can you talk me through that process? Because it's a real head scratcher to me. Like,
Well, well, I agree. I mean, it's it's one thing. There's different ways of selling things to Hollywood, right?
Mhm.
So one of the things you're doing is you're kind of, if you're like a minor 49er, you're not digging for gold yourself. You're actually oftentimes selling them the pans, and and selling them the Levi's. You're like the general store. So many of the projects I've done have been IP, where they
Mhm.
come to me, or there's an open assignment. We want to adapt this novel. We want to adapt this graphic novel. We want to adapt this TV show from Europe. We want to adapt this old film. I've done all of those things. So there's a lot of that. And then once you get those jobs, then you can do what you want within the framework of that. You can bring those other narratives out. Now, it's interesting the two movies you pointed out, The Matrix and Fight Club, both of which movies I like a lot. But if you look at the people behind them, and there's a lot of unhappiness in both of those movies.
Yeah.
Obviously, if you look at the Wachowski brothers, or now sisters, I think you can kind of understand why.
Mhm.
These were, who've completely changed their sexual identity and their existence. They were, why they did that. I don't want to get into their background. I don't know them that well.
Mhm.
I did a rewrite of one of their movies once, a movie they had done for Warner Brothers, based on a book. I used to, I used to tell people it was Die Hard in a building. Obviously Die Hard is Die Hard, but that's what it was. It was a variation on a
I didn't
Die
know
Hard
Die
movie.
Hard happened someplace else.
No, I know, but it was ridiculous. It was
Yeah.
a Die Hard movie where a guy wakes up. He just comes to the office, and he's getting some coffee, and it was a fun movie.
Hmm.
Didn't get made, and his boss pulls a gun on him, says, "I hate to do this to you, Henry." He's about to kill him, throws the coffee pot at him, and the entire movie is just a chase through this skyscraper, and people are trying to kill him the entire time, and he doesn't know why. And that's the mystery, is why.
Hmm.
But there you understand it. And also, the guy who wrote Fight Club was, very much in the closet at that time, and he was dealing with his own issues and sexual identity. So you
Hmm.
have two guys there that have a lot of personal pain that they're working through,
Yeah.
and a lot of anger towards the world for not accepting them as they were. And they
Hmm.
kind of project that out. You could say projectile vomit that out.
Hmm.
And because there's a lot of unhealthy people trying to tell stories, because you have to have an incredible burning desire to do it. A lot of people just go, it's a lot easier to go to law school and just have a wife and kids. And, you know, when you go to Hollywood, I should sometimes would give lectures of wannabe screenwriters. I said, look, if you have anything else you can do, you should do it, because
Yep.
because you're going to be going up against people that won't lose. They're absolutely
Hmm.
determined to do this. They'll burn the boats behind them. They'd rather be homeless, and they will sacrifice everything to do this. And if you have a more moderate life and you want to have a more balanced existence, you probably will gravitate towards that. And these people that are more extreme will win, because they really have a burning, burning, burning desire to tell stories. So, and those people who have that obsessive quality also oftentimes have not the most healthy personal lives. Maybe it's addiction. We can look at that, or alcoholism, or like those writers we just mentioned. So all of that can lead to a twisted worldview, and
Mm.
there's not a lot of balance. There's not a lot of religion. There's not a lot of even health. These people, a lot of them aren't working out. There's a lot of drugs and alcohol involved, and you know that can create some of those kind of nihilistic narratives that come from the people. Really, art still comes from, as much as we like to act like Hollywood is a machine and it's IP and all this, at the end of the day, it's still a personal process, and those personal things will come out.
Yeah.
So that's part of how it got to be the way it was.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, what I hear you saying is something akin to, it's a work of the soul. Like narrative
Sure.
story art is a work of the soul, and if your soul is in a state of disrepair and brokenness, that's going to merge out of you, and then simultaneously you will feel a greater gravitas and attraction to the kinds of stories that maybe just resonate with that
Sure.
brokenness that is going on in your soul. I wonder still about that component on, so you know the check writers. So the story, there are, I don't know, countless pitches being made every single day to executives and studios, and the things that get made and the things that don't get made. I understand that it has to make money. I understand that. And I understand, I'm not cynical enough to be like, well, that's what it's all about. No, money is an exchange of value. So if people think there's going to be value, they will exchange. I will go to the movie theater. I'll pay 17, 18 bucks for that ticket. And that's an exchange in my time and value for something that I think is valuable. I'm really curious what that process is like for someone that's like, I actually want to tell a better story. So I think of Sylvester Stallone. I keep coming back to this over and over, and things I've been writing and reflecting on recently. I think of Sylvester Stallone in 1975, looking around at the state of new Hollywood. He's looking around at culture. It was kind of a dark, cynical era then, too, as well. By his own words, he's looking at the stories coming out of Hollywood, and he, in his own words, described it as anti-society, anti-Christ, anti-everything. And he has the wherewithal to say, I'm going to do something about it. How does that happen today? What could actually happen for those that feel that same sort of, you could call it calling, that Stallone had, to be like, I want to tell a better story? How does that happen? And how does it get to the right people that will say, I will write the check for that, or I will get that thing off the
Well,
ground?
well, you got to imagine. Look, it seems impossible today, but Rocky's a very classic Hollywood movie.
Mm-hmm.
It's an underdog boxing movie. There'd been made dozens just like it beforehand.
Yeah.
Where a guy who's a bum, and he's got one last shot, and he becomes uh you know Bogart had been boxing movies. John Wayne had. The boxing movie was a genre people understood.
Mm.
Now, what you've got to do is stay, and I love Rocky, but in people, ever since then, the critics, the same people, have hated it because that's the kind of thing they hate. They hate anything wholesome and good and that makes you feel like there's meaning. Because again, most critics are very miserable people, and they're steeped in, European critical thought,
Mhm.
and all of that stuff is very toxic, and it's not
Yeah.
American. It's all from
Yeah.
Europe. Most of those ideas came from Europe. But you stay within a genre. You say, look, here's how you pitch Rocky. It's an underdog story. It's like, remember the champ. The champ had been around. It's like the champ, but it meets this. And then they go, yeah, I get it. And can you make it for this much money? And they weren't thinking we're gonna make a movie that's gonna be an all time great. They're like, we'll make a sports picture. We know sports movies make money. We know boxing movies make money. We know underdog movies make money. That's why, he had multiple offers to have other actors play the role. The studios just wanted to buy it and just make a boxing picture, with Burt Reynolds or somebody like that. Um, he made it more than that, and that's what I was saying before. Is you take a generic story and you can make it
Mm.
more than that. I mean, Rocky's not anything narrative wise that you go, oh my God, that was
Hmm.
transcendent. It's like a guy who kind of, just waits for the fight and trains, and people say he can't do it, but he thinks he can. And I uh I did a project once with an actor who had played Stallone's son in his name's Milo Ventimiglia, and he had played his son in, I think, one of the Rocky movies. And the very famous clip, that people always cut online. It goes, life is hard, and
Yeah.
if you let it, it'll beat you down.
Yeah.
It's not how hard you can hit, it's how hard you can get hit. And he told me, he said, Stallone totally improvised that on the set. He
What?
said, he said, I was doing the scene with him. We were talking, and he goes, life's hard. And he goes, wait a minute. He goes, somebody bring me a pad. And he was like, he acted, yeah, he goes, life's, and he came back a few minutes later. He goes, okay, let's do it again. And he read all that scene. He said it was completely done on the spot. And now it's a legendary scene because it came from the moment, a really good actor knows, what they're drawing from in life, and it came from his own life, and he just wrote it up right there. And that's why it resonates with people, because they're like, that's exactly true. That's what life is. You gotta get hit hard, and you got to keep moving forward, because life can crumple people. We've all seen it. They get hit one time because they've lived a coddled existence, or they thought everything was supposed to be perfect, and it just crushes them, and they never really recover. I've known people like that. Everyone has. And that's why those lines that Stallone says, it's not how hard you can hit, it's how hard you can get hit and keep going forward. That really, connects to people. So so yeah, you're working within a genre that's pre-existing,
Hmm.
and you work within that. You don't come in and go, Hollywood doesn't, I'm going to tell us a moral, uplifting story that you guys don't know how to tell anymore, and it's going to make $1 billion. If you did that, they just go, okay, thank you.
Mhm.
They call the agent, who's this nut?
Yeah.
You come in and you go, I'm going to tell a sports story. I'm going to tell a war movie. I'm going to tell, a modern Western. You gotta tell it to them in a way they can understand. And then you can say it's the hero. Here's the reversal. Here's this.
Hmm.
That's how you pitch these stories. You pitch it in their language, and and so they go, yeah, I get it. Okay, he's a boxer. And we're going to make this for a price. It's basically a B movie, which is just means a budget movie. And it's doable. No one knew it was going to become the phenomenon it did.
Hmm.
Uh, I worked with Irwin Winkler before, who produced those movies, and it's set him up very well. Him and his son and his family, and you go in the offices, you see all the Rocky posters. Even though Stallone and him had a falling out because he took the Creed character and made this new series and cut Stallone out.
Hmm. That's the thing that I struggle to wrap my mind around. Just again, I'm not an industry insider. I study this in a more academic sense and cultural theology. I guess I don't understand why I see so many things that are just absolute home runs as in the last 5 years, and especially in this vibe shift I've been describing and talking about. I look at a Top Gun Maverick, I look at a Project Hail Mary, I look on the small screen at something like A Night of the Seven Kingdoms, and I go, all of these feel like such a breath of fresh air. They're critically acclaimed, they're crushing in the box office. Help someone like me that doesn't understand the inner workings of the world
Well,
understand why that's so hard.
all of those are recent movies.
Hmm.
And they are in, obviously, Top Gun is an exception because
Hmm.
that's a legacy project, and that's
Right.
Tom Cruise. So that, remove that from the equation. You really have to look, and even Knights of the Seven Kingdoms is just a sequel
Yeah.
to Game
Right.
of Thrones. You got to take those out. And the Hail Mary project is again, he had done the Mars movie and was successful with that. But that's a shift in the zeitgeist. In the last, I would say, 8 years, we really went through the worst storytelling period in Hollywood history. And
Wow.
now you're starting to see a shift back. And that was really in reaction to a lot of politics, a lot of other things. We really went through the woke period of storytelling. And again, it was top down storytelling where you said, we're going to have this kind of an agenda. And you lost what made Hollywood great. And Hollywood isn't about an agenda. Remember the old, I think it was Louis B. Mayer said, if you want to send a message, use Western Union. You got to tell good stories. You know, it's like on Smallville, we used to say, we'll hide the peas in the mashed potatoes. It all starts with story. And everybody forgot that. There was a collective amnesia for 8 years when they thought, we're going to force, whether it's a racial reckoning or a woke narrative, we're going to force it down people's throats because this is what's good for them and they need. And it almost destroyed Hollywood. It really did. They spent billions in IP that no one wanted to watch. They would not hire people who had been working in the business for years because they did not have the right, racial or ethnic makeup that they were pushing. It was just like you saw the whole country kind of go through that racial reckoning from the George Floyd era on. It really affected Hollywood in a big way, where people all wanted to be on the right side of history and they wanted to prove they were allies and whatnot. And they literally forgot how to tell story. And they came at it with as ideologues, and they came at it as like a preachy school teacher. And here's what you want, and here's what you need, and everybody. I mean, they made so many shows that have been even yanked off of streaming. They spent fortunes on development deals. None of it was good because it is a craft, and if you don't have the craft, it's all terrible. And the stuff was just awful. And that's what happened. That's why what you're looking at now is Hollywood almost went broke, and it's on the verge still, and it's going through massive turmoil, but they're trying to get back to what worked because people are like, oh yeah, we knew what worked and we didn't do it because we thought we had a monopoly on storytelling and we destroyed it. And all the mergers you're seeing now and all of that stuff is all because of that. Warner Brothers is basically, was bought by a cable company, and now it's just getting merged into Paramount. I mean, these were things that would have been impossible before, but they pushed an ideological narrative that destroyed the business framework because they forgot that at the end of the day, Hollywood's always worked because it was never ideological and it was never, for instance, America used to have a serious literary, tradition. We serious writers could make money. Hemingway and, Faulkner, their books came out and they sell, and a lot of other writers, you know, could really make a living. But the they kept coming out with things, and the new writer said, "I've got to do something more different, something more original." And it kept becoming more and more obscure until by the 90s and the 2000s, you had minimalist writing and writing that, only appealed to professors. The same thing happened to our art. We used to have, a guy like Norman Rockwell's mainstream, and anyone could look at it and get it. When you have to have art explained to you by a professor or a critic, whether it's in music, atonal music, Rothko or Pollock in art, and now one of the interesting things about Pollock is it's come out and we've learned that he was a CIA op. Nobody ever
know
liked
that.
Pollock, but it was pushed by the CIA to try and undermine the Soviets. A lot of that art was like that. But anytime it gets to where you have to have someone with a PhD telling you why you should like it, it dies. And Hollywood was never that way. We were always aimed right at, you should be able to go in and see a movie and go, I like that. I don't need someone to tell me why it's good and why it's good for me. And we forgot all of those lessons. In that 8-year period, people thought they could just make it, and I don't even know if they really thought people would see it. They just felt good making it. And they were like, we're making a moral stand.
Yeah,
And the problem
for
is you
sure.
make enough of those and they have no returns, and you get fired and your studio gets bought out and shut and fused with other people. And that's what happened. And so you're seeing with things like Hail Mary, which is just a classic Hollywood movie, and it
Mhm.
works. It seems so refreshing because people haven't been doing it for almost a decade.
Mhm.
And that's why people have been going back to the older catalog. Young kids go back to the older catalog and they watch all the older movies because the new stuff coming out is just god awful. And it was that way because of the executives. You know,
Mhm.
they were all terrified. We have to prove we're allies. We have to prove we're on the side of goodness and
Mhm.
justice. And
It,
so
it
that's what.
oddly it oddly reminded me of, for so many years I would watch things, I'd turn on the TV or pull up something on Netflix or Disney Plus, and this feels like a weird comparison, but I was a 90s Christian youth group kid where we had all of these. That was kind of the beginning of, like, you know, Christian movies, and none of us liked them, even though they were supposed to be written for us and like youth group kids and our values, because it felt like everything, the conclusion was already there from
Yeah,
the
they're corny.
beginning. And
They're
you
corny and they're
knew,
awful.
you knew, like, and it felt preachy.
It did.
And
And that's why you didn't need that when Hollywood was working. It it told those same stories, but a little grittier because it
yeah,
was America was still a Christian nation,
yeah.
and it would still tell a story like Rocky, which
Mhm.
I mean, you got like the old, his brother in law's drinking. You would never have that in the Christian movies,
Right.
but people like said, oh, we know an old drunk guy.
Sure.
It felt more real, and I
Yeah.
remember those Christian movies and the music, and they were corny, is what it was, and kids
Yeah.
didn't want that. They can sense when something's real. And
Mhm.
and but you didn't need those types of Christian movies when Hollywood did that job that was just telling American movies, right?
Mhm.
It was telling American stories, and yeah, it could get a little gritty, and but it wasn't dwelling on it. It didn't tell the story of the drunk brother-in-law. Like Hollywood today would tell that story. Like all you
Sure.
do is
Right.
follow him.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the difference being between, I think, in my own household, which, for the most part was fairly strict. It was very much in a kind of an evangelical mode in the 80s and 90s. It was very suspicious of culture outside, and as I look back, for probably some good reasons too. But I do think of the movies my parents felt comfortable bringing into the house, and I think of a movie like Indiana Jones and the Last
Right.
Crusade, and that you have this scene where Indy takes this leap of faith. And I remember those became like reference points for future pastor sermons. So there's this kind of weird thing happening where even stuff still kind of latent in culture, you know, I think we've seen a change in Spielberg and
Well, you got to
recently.
remember, but Spielberg was the quintessentially American kid.
Yeah.
He was one of the few kids when he was a Boy Scout who had every single badge you can get.
Yeah.
Like, my son was an Eagle Scout, but he didn't have every single badge ever that they'd made. Spielberg was one of the few kids who did that. So he was a very American kid. His dad had been in World War II. So he was telling those stories, but over time, as the culture shifted, to
Yes.
stay relevant,
Yeah.
everybody wants to stay relevant. But
Right.
there were tons of movies made in the 80s and 90s that had those classic storytelling things. Even a movie like Terminator, the first Terminator,
Yeah.
yes, here's a guy fighting for humanity and he's fighting evil and the robots. And the first Indiana Jones, the Nazis want the Ark to have power, and there's obviously there's belief in God
Mhm.
in Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom because it would have no power at all. The power is stated very clearly. It's God's power. It's his thing. So these are movies that absolutely they never even make. No one in Indiana Jones goes, "Oh yeah, that's corny." They believe it because people still very much believed in God, and look, that was 80. That was easily over 40 years ago.
Right.
There's been a drift towards atheism, and again pushed by the same people that push those narratives, the elite, cultural elite, in the New York Times. They've pushed atheism. They've pushed the same sort of things we talked about in the movies. It's more of a European point of
Mhm.
view that for a long time we had an inferiority complex to Europe, and we kind of slavishly tried to follow their culture. And if you were, sophisticated and elite, you would, be an atheist, you'd have existential cynicism, all of these things. But America was able to resist that cynicism for a long time. And then we kind of collapsed and gave into it, but we also gave into real Soviet ideologue more than that kind of European,
No, it's definitely
Jean-Paul
Marx
Sartre.
for sure.
Yeah,
It's
we
Marx.
truly went to a Soviet era ideologue with the woke DEI stuff in Hollywood, and it kind of coalesced with the 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 COVID thing. Those two
Mhm.
things came together to create something like, I've never seen in America. We really, I mean, you had people ratting out their neighbors for not wearing a mask, and you thought, well, this is like East Germany, not America. We're the land of the free, the home of the brave. And you saw we were the land of the cloistered and the cowardly.
Mm.
It really affected our national character. It was
So
a real big.
how do we actually tell a better story right now? And how do those stories, I guess part of me, I am encouraged when I see, even though I wouldn't necessarily see these as like the ultimate hero movies, but when I see something like The Backrooms or Obsession that are the products of YouTubers, not going through some sort of traditional channel, eventually, A24 picks up the Backrooms. My kids got into this series, and I'm drawing a blank on the name of it, Digital Circus or something like that. It was a YouTube series, and they just organically built a following, and then were selling privately to theaters
Well, I think
directly.
that's how interesting movies have to get made.
Hmm.
Studios aren't green lighting any of these types of movies. I mean, you know, yes, you can do a horror movie. And
Right.
Jason Blum, he was a co-producer with me on Ascension, and I know the way he kind of has a farm, a factory, I would say.
Hmm.
They just basically look for horror movies, they make them for a price, and then they see which is the best and they get released. But he picked that one up after it was already completed. I would certainly say that's the way to get movies done for a price
Hmm.
is that way, look, the Hollywood system is teetering. Everyone has a distribution system now. YouTube is a much more powerful distribution system than any TV network.
Hmm.
If you can get your product on YouTube and you can get it known, why do you need Hollywood at all?
Hmm.
Hollywood is its only function has ever been is like three things. One is it's a bottleneck. So, for instance, you could not do TV unless you went through a network, right? Because they owned the real estate. You had to get it on the air. Now, when cable came along, you said, "Well, we can get it on a cable channel, maybe." But then the networks came and they bought all those cable channels, so it was the same people in charge of it. Um, and also, TV is very expensive. It's more expensive than movies, and when you actually stretch it out a season of TV, you can hundreds of millions of dollars for successful shows. So nobody can bankroll that. You had to go through the studios. So studios and networks were banks, is what they primarily were. And then they controlled the bottleneck. Now the bottleneck's been broken. Now, yes, money's still obviously always an issue. And you see issues with those movies you mentioned. I know there'd been commentary on X about, well, why aren't we getting more money on the back end, below the line
Hmm.
producers and I mean production
Hmm.
designers complaining
Hmm.
about that. So
Yeah.
there's all money's always an issue because making a movie is expensive. You have to take all these people out to an area where you're cordoning off the whole area and you're filming all day long. You have to have security there, and you have to feed them, and you have to make sure they're safe. There has to be safety people there, and it's expensive. There's just no way around it. Anytime you run film on TV or film, it costs money. There's just no way to do it for cheap. You can go, well, I can get a digital camera and shoot it. Well, the film is nothing. The
Yeah.
digital film is not the cost at all. It's everything else.
Yeah.
Try and do one stunt. You'll see how expensive one single stunt is. Even if you have, I remember when I first started writing, I said, well, we'll just take the guy and we'll slam him into the car and he'll say, I never want to see you in this neighborhood again. It's just a simple thing. we get, it's like, well, okay, we've got the 3 different hoods that are built that we can put on the stunt cars, and they'll have the indentations. And it's like, we have
Mhm.
safety people there. And it's like, you're like, this is $150,000 for that one scene. It gets very expensive. And safety is a real thing too. People, have gotten killed with guns on sets, as you saw at that
Yeah.
movie, that Western,
Yeah.
one of the things you're supposed to do on a set. When I heard about that Western, I said, I can't believe that, because the first thing you do is the armorer comes out on set and he holds up the gun and he goes, we have a weapon on the set. And he shows it, he chambers it, it's unarmed, it has
Mhm.
nothing in it. He has to go around anyone he says, does anyone want to inspect the weapon? People will raise their hands. Every single person on that set who says, I want to look at it, will say, let me look at it. He'll show him it's empty. And then they'll go around there. I don't know how a live round got put in a gun and handed to an actor. That's,
That's
but that kind of
crazy.
stuff. But you see why movies are expensive.
Right.
There's a lot of development, a lot of cost. And so that's always going to be an issue. But, with AI animation, that will probably go away, is it gets photorealistic, and you can tell stories that way. A lot of the costs will go away. I don't
Yeah, but
know.
don't I guess I'm just struggling to
I
wrap
don't know
my
if people
mind
will
around
see
this,
it.
Philip. It just makes no sense to me that why doesn't I mean, obviously Tom Cruise is Tom Cruise and Top Gun was already an IP and bringing that back made some sense. But I mean, we've seen other IP just bomb. We've seen Star Wars bomb because it just didn't have a coherent story that was in keeping with Lucas's monomyth, the hero's journey, Joseph Campbell stuff. I mean, so it's not just a guarantee that IP lands or it doesn't land. How in the world do we ever, why is it so hard to actually get the like check writers to look at a story and go, man, I know the Project Hail Mary crushed. I know that I'm hearing great things. I haven't seen it yet, but I'm hearing great things. I mean, obviously it's a pre-existing IP. I'm hearing great things about the Spider-Man movie. Something F1 was another one that I thought, I mean, yeah, it's Brad Pitt, but it's an original story. It wasn't IP unless we get a Days of Thunder tie-in here at some point for the sequel,
Well,
which like
well, a
why
lot of
is this
that,
so hard? I mean, you
a lot of
those are good stories. Why
a
can't
lot
they
of
get
that had
made?
to do with the executives and the producers. It's
Yeah.
like I said, all of it is who's developing it. Like
Mhm.
I had a meeting with Lucas once, and we were talking about a TV show. And I pitched him. I said, I'd love the Star Wars comics when I was a kid. I
Mhm.
said, we should do Adventure of Han Solo as he goes to plane. It's like kind of a Western in space.
Yeah.
And he had another idea we talked about. And I said, well, what studio do you want to go to? What network? Where do you want to sell it? He goes, no, I'm not. I'm just going to write it and we'll produce it. And I'm going, oh yeah, you're worth $2 billion. You can just do that. But that's how
You can do
rich
that.
you have to be to do that.
Okay.
But I remember talking to him and being struck by how obsessively real all of his world was to him. Even Jar Jar Binks, it was all real. It was like he was talking about his family and his children.
Mm.
He really loved those characters and protected them, and they were real to him. And then Kathleen Kennedy came in, and Disney came in, and they kind of just threw up all over the audience. They said, we don't want to appeal to the audience that it had before. We're looking at matrices on who can watch it, and we're going to appeal to these people instead. The same thing with superhero movies. That's why they
Mhm.
ruined superhero movies. We'll make them more female friendly. We'll make them more this. We'll make them more that. Well, you lost the boys, and boys are the sci-fi geeks, and they bring their
Mhm.
girlfriends, and they were the superhero geeks, and and you always made stuff for the girls too. But when you shifted it completely to a female point of view, the boys didn't have anyone they could identify with. They literally forgot the boys. And Kathleen Kennedy really ruined that franchise. That was a home run. It can still come back. You've seen it for a couple of seasons of The Mandalorian. It was
Mhm.
really first
Yeah.
2 seasons just felt like old Star Wars, and people loved
Yeah,
it.
for sure.
And then she
Fantastic.
came in and took over that and ruined that as well. But um, it's
So how
it's
does it
the
get changed
executives.
though? Like, I guess the thing I want to come back around to
She's
is I'm
fired.
yeah, yeah.
You just have to wait till they get fired. There's nothing, if you have bad executives, that's one of the things, and you keep striking out, you'll get fired.
Mm.
That's what
Yeah.
used to happen because it was a business you had to make money in.
Yeah.
And that stopped happening, and they basically pushed all the blame on the fans and on the and I was like, that's not Hollywood. Hollywood used to be very ruthless. If you can't get the job done, you're out.
Mm.
And they let these people that just kept falling upward over and over and over again, and they didn't know what they were doing. But it's all the gatekeepers. It's the gatekeepers. There's all the storytelling is out there. All the artists are out there. All the filmmakers are out there, but they couldn't get through.
Hmm.
And in particular, white men, white young guys could not get arrested. I remember during that era, the studios. I remember my agent telling me HBO says we will not hire any white showrunners. And in a lot of these shows, these things where white kids had loved Star Wars and they couldn't get hired. They couldn't do the
Hmm.
things they loved to do. And they handed them to people who very clearly said they made fun of these properties.
Hmm.
They made fun of the superhero stuff. That we're going to reinvent them. These are misogynistic. These
Yeah.
are dated.
Deconstruction. Yeah.
Yeah, these are dated. They're this, they're that. They very much turn their nose up at him. But we, the geniuses we are going to deign to bring these dated properties into the modern era. You heard them saying this isn't anything.
Yeah.
Whether it was She-Hulk or Cinderella or whatever, Sleeping Beauty, all of these things, they said these things, and it turned the audiences off.
So
In the old days, they would have been fired in a heartbeat for saying that.
it seems like there's enough demand for something better. It seems like there is in heartland America, here in the Midwest, you get outside of maybe these kind of echo chambers in, maybe New York City and in Hollywood where there might be some groupthink there or lack of exposure to worldviews outside of what happens in those echo chambers. But I see demand and I see a hunger among
Oh
people
yeah.
for better stories. What do you see as barriers from making? I know there are kind of like smaller studios they're trying to get stuff off the ground. If there's this much demand, and there will always be demand, if it's really actually true that we long for true stories that point us towards what's true, good, and beautiful, that's in our nature, that will always be there. We've been telling those stories for thousands of years. We will keep telling those stories till kingdom come. How do we actually, from an
I think they're
aspiring
already being.
writer to someone that's like, I want to get these things made, what are the roadblocks to either new studios emerging or alternatives that aren't, and I don't want to name any names. I think one frustration that I do see sometimes is these kind of like alternative studios emerge, and I understand the desire to do something like politically counter to what you see in Hollywood, but it feels still stuck in that Marxist trap that all art is inherently political. And it's like, no, you're playing
Yeah.
by the rules of that game. And it's not true. Like good
Well,
art is vertically oriented, it's transcendent. So how do we get people together to make something that could actually produce those things?
well, it's kind of like you were saying before. It's like that era when people are doing, people are always like, there has to be conservative media. And whenever you hear that, you're like, oh, this
No.
is going to suck.
Yes.
It's going to
Right.
suck because
For the
it's
same
going to be
reasons the other
boring.
stuff sucks.
Yeah. You have to tell it. Just like, look, some of the most conservative movies you've ever seen, ever, were produced by some of the most liberal people you've ever known.
Yeah.
I know all the producers in Hollywood. A lot of them are incredibly liberal, and they'll turn out incredibly conservative movies. It's not their ideology. They just want to make things and make money. So the way to do it is, first of all, you go, we want to make money and we want to tell good stories. And the ideology, we're not ideologues for the right or the left.
Yeah.
And that's just American filmmaking doesn't live there. It never has.
Yeah.
What's name, people will say John Wayne's movies are right wing or whatever. If you watch John Wayne's collective works, they show more understanding of Native Americans and the history of America, and they almost always take a positive bent towards Indians
Mhm.
at a time when they were not looked upon kindly.
Mhm.
And so you can go, well, that seems liberal. These great movies are not,
Those categories
Humphrey
break
Bogart.
down. They're just not good
Yeah.
categories.
They're just not. It's you cannot be conservative or liberal. You cannot be right or left. You just have to make a good story, and the good stories are one where good overcomes evil. The good guys win, and then you recreate an equilibrium in the end. It may not be the way it was, but it's different. But people are going to find a path and move forward. That's what people want. They want to know the world is not chaos and evil. Machiavelli
Right.
used to say, look, the good have to resist the evil. Otherwise, the world will be in turmoil at all times. And so, Hollywood should understand evil exists and sometimes it comes into our life, but we have to confront it and we have to overcome it. Those are the lessons we're telling people. Now, these aren't moral didactic lessons like you
Right.
would get, in a Sunday school lesson to a
Mhm.
fifth grader. They're stories that resonate to people who go, I know life is hard, but it's not how hard you can get hit. It's how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. Those are the kind of stories that work. And you can go, well, are those moral stories? Or are they not? They are. They're not necessarily sermons, but a preacher can take that part out of it, just like you were saying before, and
Yeah.
say, this is what life is.
Hmm.
Life is like that. It's going to knock you down sometimes. And I guarantee you, it's not all, what does he say? It's not all sunshine and rainbows, Stallone. He says that in the scene.
Yeah.
It'll knock you down. And that's what we need, is that kind of storytelling. And we don't need to be, people really hate being lectured, whether it's on the right with those kind of movies we were talking about,
Mhm.
or on the left being told
Yeah.
about DEI or woke or systemic racism or systemic this evil or patriarchy. People don't like that either. They don't want to be lectured to. If you want to send a message, use Western Union, you have to just tell good stories. And those are stories, whether it's a boxing story, a football story, a war story, a love story, a man overcoming, injustice story, whatever it is, they're universal stories. They've always worked. They're Westerns, I mean, look, Unforgiven, Clint Eastwood, right? Or Outlaw, Josie Wells. Those are both anti-heroes. I mean,
Mhm.
an Unforgiven, Clint Eastwood says he's basically the worst man who's ever lived. Like, he's killed women and children, he says, but at the end of the day, you're rooting for him and you want him to win. Because why? He says, you just, what is that Gene Hackman says when he goes into the bar? He says, you just shot an unarmed man, William Money. And he goes, well, talking about that guy who went to the bar, he goes, well, then he shouldn't have been decorating his bar with my friend's body. It's like, you
Mhm.
go, okay, this is a story of loyalty. It's
Mhm.
like, and, and he's going to revenge these women who were, you know, prostitutes, but it's like, it's a story that exists in another world. But, but that's a great movie. You want to see this guy overcome and win, and because
Yeah.
he's changed his life, and he's trying to do good, and he gets pulled back into it, and then they do these things. You want to see him win.
Yeah.
That's Unforgiven. I love that movie. Josie Wells, again, great
Mhm.
movies.
Yeah, I think sometimes, and I have to bring this up to people because they hear me championing the things like a Project Hail Mary. And it's not that I think all of them have to take that specific genre shape or narrative shape, that it has to be warm and fuzzies when you leave the movie theater. I think you confront the perennial problems and struggles of human nature. You
Yes.
confront, and I think the thing that I'm trying to get at, Philip, is it's, the kind of Marxist story was that all of life can be reduced to its horizontal dimension of dialectic materialism, struggle for who's got power, who doesn't, who's got access to resources, who doesn't. It flattens everything to the political. And what I'm trying to get at is like the real great works of art, whether it's in film, television, music, a painting, it opens up and unlocks that vertical transcendent dimension to life, the perennial spiritual longings of the human soul. And it could be in an anti-hero. I see, I think, well, I mean, one of my favorite superhero movies is Logan. And Logan is in many ways a kind of John Wayne kind of figure. He has struggles with the nature of his violence, and that his violence
Sure.
always keeps him. A friend of mine put it like this: that he is the cowboy archetype, because the cowboy has to make these sacrifices that are sometimes violent, but we're not called to like celebrate the violence, because at the end of the day, he's always just on the outskirts of the society that he's had to sacrifice so much to protect. And so it's
Sure.
helping us navigate with the tensions of a world that sometimes violence may be necessary, but we're not walking away going, man, violence
Yeah.
is the solution for everything. It's just this deeper layer of vertical, spiritual ache, human struggle. And I'm just like, how do we get these made? How do we get these stories made, Philip? Like, do you have
Well,
any
the way
insights?
to get them made is you know is to understand the way Hollywood works. Number one, and that's it's to pitch them in a way that they can understand.
Yeah.
If you come in and go,
Yeah, right.
Hollywood's not making these kind of
Right.
movies, and we
Right.
want to get them made, and this will be redemptive.
Yep.
They won't even understand that. You just go in and you pitch.
Yeah.
Here's a look. Here's a movie about the Earth is in it's a disaster pick, right?
Mhm.
The Earth we've got some sort of a virus coming off the sun that's eating. It's going to destroy the Earth. We've got to there's another planet, a million miles away that if we can get to it, somehow they're surviving. It's a disaster pick. It's a sci-fi adventure story.
Mhm.
He's got to get there. He's got to get the thing and he's got to get it back, right? That's they go, oh, cool. And it's a sci-fi book and it's IP written by the guy who did this Mars thing. And it's but they're not going, and this is gonna be a real feel-good movie, and it's gonna be different than all the other movies you make, and
Yeah.
you're gonna like it. It's just gonna be that's in the execution. You don't pitch that. You never pitch anything other than here's the story, here's why it works. People go, oh, it's a sci-fi disaster movie. It's got to save the world. We've seen a million of those, right? Armageddon, comet movies, asteroid movies. That's how you do that. And that movie works. And the rest is all the execution. And that's where the individual artist comes in and does something interesting. But Logan, which you mentioned before, was written by Michael Green, who used to work on Smallville with me. And a lot of
Oh, cool. I didn't
those
realize that.
oh yeah, Michael, a lot of those things, those kind of Easter egg things you were talking about, Michael had done as well. I remember there's a scene where someone kisses Clark and they go, do you use like Arctic mint breath mints? Because they were in reference to the Fortress of
Beautiful.
Solitude.
Yeah.
There's lots of things like that we would always put in there, and we would always try. I always liked writing Lex a lot because you know where
Mm.
he's going to go,
That's the best
and it's going to.
Lex ever done on screen, by the way. I mean,
Oh,
between
thank you,
Michael, I forget what's Michael's last
Michael
name.
Rosenbaum.
Yeah, his performance and the way he's written. For me, that's the best Lex that's ever been on screen.
Well, he was great to write, and especially early on. Tom wasn't really a great actor yet. He got much better as time
Mhm.
went on, but Michael really could carry the line. So we'd write a lot for him, and you knew where he was going to end up. And so you tried to make him sympathetic. You wanted to see
Yeah.
his father, and especially the way his father was. You could see him struggling. He wanted to do good, but
Hmm.
he had this in him. But yeah, Michael was always fun to work with on the show. Uh,
Yeah.
and I was happy to see Logan come out and do well. Where were we before? We were talking about how do you get these kind of movies made? Well,
Yeah.
that's how you do it. You pitch them within the framework of what Hollywood knows. And I do think that Hollywood has learned its lesson.
Hmm.
I mean, look, when you say you go woke, you go broke, that's everyone in Hollywood is saying that now. No one is out there beating the drums for more of that stuff. No one will
Mhm.
touch it with a 10-foot pole. The stuff you're seeing coming out now was done and greenlit during that era, the great woke awakening era.
Mhm.
And it's still dribbling out. Because remember, there's a long lead time to movies, years.
Right.
So I think in the next 5 or 6 years, you're going to see a massive turn away from that and the stuff that comes out. Marvel won't be doing it. Star Wars is going to have all new leadership. It's like an aircraft carrier. It takes a long time for it to turn around. It takes like 5 miles for an aircraft carrier to stop, something like that, and it takes a long time to turn. And that's what Hollywood's like. So I think the things you're seeing now and rightfully identify, I'm hoping that because otherwise it won't exist. Hollywood won't exist if it doesn't make money. It's not government funded. It has to make money.
Right.
It has to make money and it won't exist. But I remember during the middle of that period when the studios wouldn't touch anything or anyone that didn't fit that mandate, they would not. Projects that you knew would be greenlit 100 times, no one would touch. You're like, what's going on here? It was a very, very strange period. And I remember this show came out on Amazon, and it was kind of like the first sprigs of daylight. And I said, "Look, this is." I saw it. I told my wife. I said two things. This show will be hated by the critics and just Ruth because it contradicts the narrative they're trying to shove down everyone's throat,
Mm-hmm.
and it will do hugely well.
Hmm.
And it was the Kill List, and it was a classic.
Hmm.
Someone screwed with my. It's one of my kids always say my favorite genre is someone screwing with my kids, and the dad goes and kills everybody. Kind of,
Taken. Yeah.
Taken. I love
Yeah.
those kind of movies. And Kill
Yep.
List is someone like tries to kill him and his wife or his kids or something, and he goes out and he's a former Navy SEAL, and he goes and kills. It's Chris Pratt. The next day I see the reviews. They're just ruthless because this doesn't fit the new mandate of what Hollywood was supposed to be doing. And they kind of synced it up, with the elite on the East and the West Coast and just attacked it. And it had billions of views. It was hugely successful, but they were hoping it was like just an anomaly, and they kept doing it for years, uh, from She-Hulk to, the new Wonder Band, which I watched the pilot of that. I'm like, this is terrible. This stuff's terrible. It's like, how does this stuff get greenlit? Well, they were greenlighting it based on ideology. And
Yeah.
that's where Hollywood failed. It was never ideological before that. Even, they made a few ideological, you hear the stories about the blacklist and, the House on Un-American activities and the
Hmm.
communists and the
Hmm.
witch hunts.
Yeah.
It was all true. Those people were serious communists,
Hmm.
and but they didn't necessarily make communist movies because they couldn't, because the studios were, no, I mean, they were all
Yeah.
hardcore Communist
For
Party
sure.
members,
Yeah.
and there was no doubt about it. It wasn't a witch hunt. It was real. Turned, they've turned the tables on it, and in movie after movie said how these poor people were innocent and they've been persecuted. Nope, they were all commies. And I actually met quite a few of those guys. I remember Dmitrik was one of the guys who named names, and
Mm.
Polanski was one of the guys who was blacklisted. And when I first got to Hollywood in the '90s, they were still both around. They hated each other, two old guys, and they'd give lectures. But it's funny because Hollywood really was a fantastic place where you could go in and see Abraham Polanski talk about body and soul, a movie
Huh.
he wrote. And Demetrius talked about the movies he wrote. You just see him before, go over to UCLA, and they'd just be sitting there talking about him. It was phenomenal for so long. It was an affordable place where everybody just really wanted to make quality stuff. They were just
Mm.
passionate about what they did. And then something happened and kind of broke the back of Hollywood. And they're trying to restructure it now. And who knows if they will or not.
Yeah. I'm hopeful, like you say. I mean, uh, I don't surf. I've got a friend that's really into surfing, and he just tells me, the waves will always give you feedback, right? And reality has a way of biting back when you go against the grain of reality. And I'm hopeful. I wouldn't say optimistic. I'm hopeful that the feedback we've gotten from reality is that actually what we need right now is what I would say, this is a loaded word. Some people will have a hard time with it, is actually genuine diversity, which means diversity of thought. The notion that life's problems are actually really, really difficult and challenging. And so when we process them through the lens of story, we're going to get a range of different potential solutions being offered to the difficult problems of life. And it doesn't just fit one easy ideological cookie cutter on any side. So I don't want this to swing back to just say, hey, what we need now is all of it to look like my youth group movies from the 90s. I don't want those either, right? Because life is really challenging. I think of the wisdom literature of the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament. You've got books like Proverbs that lay out, well, if you get up in the morning and you work hard, life will turn out well for you. And then you've got Ecclesiastes like right next to that. And the teacher of Ecclesiastes is like, meaningless, everything's meaningless. And they're just showing you the different facets of life and how challenging it is. And that's baked into the scriptures. I think there's room for that sort of stuff. And I hear you saying the same thing as well. All right. So Philip, maybe just before we go, any words of encouragement you'd have to aspiring writers, people that are trying to actually reintroduce or to tell a better story in culture right now? Do you have any words of wisdom?
Well, I would say, again, it starts and ends with the story.
Mm,
Story is the king, and that's you can call it craft, you can call it narrative, you can call it IP, whatever. But you've got to tell an interesting story to entertain, right? People used to look down on, they go, oh, that movie's just entertainment. The Indiana Jones movie is just entertainment. Well, that comes from the Latin to like grab a hold of. That's all it means, to grab a hold of somebody and hold them there and tell them a story. And they're entertained, they're listening, they're spellbound. Don't worry about, I've never once thought I'm going to write a liberal movie, a conservative movie, a religious movie, or this. It's like, yes, there are times when it will come out,
mm,
when there's a moment where someone has a Christ-like epiphany,
mm,
right? They're like, they understand the universe, but you never sit out to go, I'm going to write a movie where everybody's going to understand my religious feeling. No, you tell a story and you get caught up in that character and you see his turns and his twist and how he and what he overcomes. And then he
mm.
has an epiphany and you go, wow, but it sneaks up on you. Hide the peas and the potatoes. Tell good stories and don't come at it, because that's just like the woke DEI stuff. It came at it top down, and that's the Soviet part. When you come at it top down, when you say, here's what we need this year in our 5-year plan, here's the movies we need that are going to teach these didactic lessons, it's all
Hmm,
going to fail.
hmm,
You have to just tell a personal story. It has to be something, and also it has to be something that really, really moves you and you really want to tell it. You can't do it because you think, this is going to make a lot of money, or
hmm,
this is going to make me famous. Just say, I have this burning desire to tell this one story. It's my story and nobody can tell it better than me. And it's something that, whether it's Rocky or it's, whatever it is, it's something that's my story. And that's why I know I can do it better than anyone else, because it's mine. And that'll carry you through the hard times, because it's very hard. It's hard to say. Jason Blum used to always call it monetizing ideas. And that's what we're doing. You monetize an idea, you to sell it to a studio. And I've sold dozens and dozens of pitches and projects. And you're literally just weaving something out of air. You're telling you, but what you've got to do, I always say, it's like taking a thought bubble from your head and trying to put it into their head so they can see it and they can see what it's going to be. And whether that's pitching to a studio executive, a producer, or just your friend to raise money on, some sort of funding program and shoot it in your backyard, it's still the same thing. It's that passion. This is what Hollywood did so well, was it allowed passion to thrive.
hmm,
Now, there's David Brown, an old producer, told me that. He goes, passion begets passion. People, the thing that always sells in Hollywood is passion. You come into a room and you're passionate, and you really believe it, people get excited about that. And that's what they
hmm,
stopped doing, because they lost all direction because they got very scared of the way the culture was going, and they wanted to protect their jobs. That's a lot of it, was because they didn't fit the demographics that they were trying to promote. So they're like, uh-oh, I'm a white woman, and it's like, let me push. How do I show that I'm an ally to these narratives? And they forgot that, like, what really works is passion. Passion begets passion, and you've got to be survivor. He also told me another one. He said in Hollywood, it's like, you've got to be like a cartoon character. Those in cartoon, they'll get their head chopped off by some bus going over, and they'll just pop another head out of their neck. That's what you got to do when you get your head cut off. You just pop another head up. You got to be really resilient and really passionate.
hmm,
And those two things, whether you're in Hollywood or you're in Nebraska or Louisiana trying to tell a story, that's it. Those are the most things. Passionate. It's my story, and I'm going to keep going forward. And I do think that it's going to become more decentralized now, because
hmm,
they don't own the distribution streams anymore. And that was what really gave Hollywood its power. It had a monopoly on the bottleneck, and they don't. And anyone who can't see that's blind. They just don't have it. And so all they are now are banks, and they're
hmm,
banks that have IP. And that's why they're turning out the same kind of IP, because they're very scared. They don't know what to do anymore because they don't have a monopoly. The theatrical viewing is in the tank, and TV is gone. It's all gone to the internet. So The thing that gave them power is toast. And all they have now is the IP libraries that they bought up over time. And anyone can create new IP, and that's what scares them. But the only thing they have too is a marketing budget to get that to cut through all the noise and to get people to go see it. So I think
Well,
we're going to
Philip,
see the biggest changes we've ever seen in Hollywood.
yeah, yeah, that I'm encouraged. I'm encouraged by that possibility, and I think of people in our Good Makers network that have these aspirations. We keep using this phrase around here about the restoring of culture. You know, kind of playing on the word restore, but to restore culture is the necessary precondition for us to restore it. So I hope people listening to this now, what Phillips has just said, offers you some real encouragement, practical wisdom. Start with story, see what emerges. I think that what I hear you talking about in that process is having this trait of openness and wonder, even as you're writing. I'm just now starting to dabble in the world of fiction a little bit for my own writing, and but what I've heard from people that have years of doing this is how, interestingly enough, characters that they write do things that they didn't plan for them to do, almost as if the characters take on a life of their own. And what stands out to me is that reminds me of that vertical dimension we're talking about, of openness to something beyond you. And even having that in the craft of your story, I think is doing something in your soul that creates the kind of conditions for something beautiful to emerge out of it. So incredible insights here, Philip. This has been absolutely fantastic. Are there any things you're working on right now, or places people can check out the things you're doing?
I'm developing a biopic on a very famous singer right now with his family. And I'm
Fun.
excited about that. And I'm doing two different projects. One's sci-fi. It's a TV show. I'm developing that based on some IP, and a movie as well. So, but
Fantastic.
talking one thing, one quick note there about what you were saying about character.
Yeah.
Aristotle famously says character is fate, right? And everybody repeats that, but it takes you a long time as a writer or a creator to understand that. And what it means is exactly what you said. Characters will do what they're going to do because of their character. And they'll do things that you won't expect. Once they're a fully developed character, they'll go in their own way, and that's going to be their fate. And that's
Mm,
in the end is just what's their fate. That's where they end up. And that's when you
mm,
develop a really well-rounded character. They'll break off and go whichever way you want. And it's the same way in life. Is when you get old enough in life, and you look back and you've had some high school reunions, 10, 20, 30-year high school reunions, and you look back and you go, wow, their fate was set at 16. What happened to them or what they did? You can see, you really are tied to who you are. So
mm.
and that's the same with characters.
Yeah. Well, that's great, Philip. We got to do this again. This has been fantastic. I got a million other questions to ask you here, but maybe we'll save them for some future
Sure,
episodes.
anytime.